Hi, I'm Dr. Adrian OHara, and I'm a lecturer in physiology at the University of Central Lancashire. And my research background and interests are very much involved in obesity and understanding it from the cellular and molecular perspective. In a very short overview, I'd like to just sort of give you an understanding of how, from a research perspective, we see obesity and how it comes about and drives obesity. Very much so, over the last 30 years, we've seen changes, significant changes in the levels of obesity that we see across the UK and across the globe. And so understanding what drives obesity is very important, because subsequently that can lead to potential treatments going forward. So effectively, obesity tends to be seen as this condition of abnormal and excessive fat accumulation in the adipose tissue, to an extent that health can subsequently be impaired. And at the most basic and simple view, it was very much seen as driven through energy expenditure and the calories in versus calories out view. So if you take in too many calories compared to what you actually expend from your energy, that will drive the fat accumulation and weight gain. But obviously, as time has moved on, certainly over the last 30 odd years, we now very much understand how much obesity is really a multifactorial and complex condition that can be characterized not only by this increased adiposity, but also through mild chronic inflammation. And this is what can lead to progression of other health-related conditions. So over, as I said, the last sort of 30 odd years, our understanding of how obesity comes about has grown, because the way in which we look at it from a research perspective. We tend to have 2-3 areas that are key in terms of understanding obesity. And so one of those tends to be the psychological aspects of psychology of obesity. So understanding what potentially drives obesity from a psychological point of view. So for example, researchers are very keen on understanding things like how fast food, junk food advertising has an effect on what influences someone to eat something. There's been a lot about the idea of whether or not advertising of certain types of foods should take place post 9 o'clock in the evening, to try and protect children from having these adverts in front of them, and subsequently could cause them to want to eat eat more of these fast foods, driving potentially obesity. So there's a lot of work around that that happens, and particularly down at the University of Liverpool, there's a number of work in their psychology department which looks at this kind of thing. And then you have the area which is related to sort of the physiology of obesity. And there's sort of 3 areas within that. So one of which is things like neurobiology of obesity, so understanding appetite regulation, for example, and so how that links to the role in which there are gut. So there's communication between your gut and your brain, drives appetite regulation, the idea of feeling full, and when your body tells you should or should not be taking on food. And so any effect on that appetite regulation can subsequently drive obesity. And linked to that very much is the idea of the molecular and genetic aspects of obesity. So again, we start to understand how particular genes can influence our appetite regulation or our body weight regulation. And again, that's something that has really started to come about in the last 10-15 years or so. And then the final aspect is that of the physiology around adipose tissue itself. And that's my particular area of interest. So what exactly happens to adipose tissue and the cells within it, the adipocytes, when it comes to obesity? And we understand very much now that since the early 1990s, that adipose tissue and the cells, the adipocytes, secrete proteins, some of which have roles in regulating appetite, something like leptin. And then there are others that are very much involved in inflammation. And we see that increase when we look at these markers in obese people compared to those of a healthy weight. So this really starts to drive the understanding, particularly in terms of other health conditions. So the inflammation that we see, this mild chronic inflammation we see in obesity, driven through inflammation in adipose tissue, has links to driving other conditions such as type 2 diabetes, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, high cholesterol. These kind of things are all driven through this, or can be driven through this inflammation that we see in obesity. So it's really to sort of summarize this idea of how the research aspects help us understand obesity and where it can go from there, is the fact that we do require very much a holistic approach from a research perspective to fully understand and appreciate what obesity is and what drives it. So we require to understand what happens in terms of influencing people to make these choices, potentially. We also need the idea of how the molecular genetic aspects linked to, say, appetite regulation can affect how people eat and subsequently drive obesity, and obviously understanding what happens in the adipose tissue itself to help understand inflammation, how that can be linked to conditions. And all of these, when you take it from a holistic approach, allow us to focus what areas we can look at in terms of treatment options going forward. And so there is work that goes forward to look at things like can we identify people with particular genetic changes to particular genes that are going to influence obesity, so we can understand, so whether or not we can understand that that's the reason behind a person's obesity. Equally, understanding how we can change the inflammation status within adipose tissue, for example, to try and reduce the potential conditions that can cause as well. So it requires this holistic view from all of the aspects, and not, say, the psychology, neurobiology, or obesity, the physiology of obesity, to really come together to feed on into drug trials and potential treatment options going forward. And so this is why, this is why the kind of research that we do is quite important, and coming together as a whole to look at ways, and understanding obesity is central to how we can subsequently treat it and try and reduce the impact that obesity has on people across the globe. Thank you.